All right, you guys, today we're going to talk about the end of World War II. We've talked a lot about World War II because really World War II is just a continuation of World War I. That's why we spent so much time talking about how the war actually began. We talked about what Hitler was doing and Mussolini with all their expansion in Europe. We looked at Hirohito and all the expansion from the Japanese in the Pacific. And then we looked a lot at the battles, on the major turning points. And today we're going to look at how the war ends. First, how it ends in the European theater, and then how it ends in the Pacific theater. So let's begin. So, end of the war in Europe. The end of the war in Europe is what we know as VE Day, which stands for Victory in Europe. So as we know, turning point battle of the war in Europe was... You're right, it was D-Day. After the Allies invade Italy in 1943, they get a foothold back on the European continent. And they second that with the invasion of the Normandy beaches in France. And from that, they're able to move north and south and push the Germans back into Germany. The final battle is, of course, the Battle of the Bulge, ending in the spring of 1945. And then finally, on May 8th, 1945, the Germans officially surrender. These are the Nazis that are left. Hitler, as we know, has committed suicide, and the Nazi regime is coming to a close. So they officially surrender in Berlin, which means the European theater is now done. The Allied powers can now send all of their resources to the Pacific theater. In fact, the Allied powers, they meet at a conference, and they actually determined this back in 1944. They talk about what they're going to do and how they're going to support each other in the Japanese, against the Japanese in the Pacific theater. And let's talk about that. Why are the Allies so concerned about fighting the Japanese? Because the Japanese have been very successful. They've taken over nearly 1 million square miles of land by 1942. They've spread from their tiny little nation up in the north to mainland Asia, to Indochina, down to Indonesia. They're covering as much ground as they can, and they're very successful. Partly due to the fact that they are willing to sacrifice a lot to defeat the Allied powers, specifically in the Americans, as well as some of the ANZAC, the Australian, New Zealand, and British forces. So by the final year of the war, 1944 and 1945, there are heavy losses on both sides. We see battles in which tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of men are perishing. And one of the reasons for this is because of the use of the kamikaze fighters, which are the Japanese for Japanese suicide pilots. That these Japanese fighters would be willing just to fly their plane into a ship or into a naval destroyer and sacrifice their own life just to destroy the enemy. The Japanese are refusing to surrender, despite the fact, even when it looks like they need to surrender, they still refuse to surrender, which will lead to why the Allied powers ultimately drop the atomic bomb on them. And speaking of that, the U.S. drops the bombs. We know that we have the 2 bombs that are dropped. August 6, 1945 at 8:15 in the morning, the United States drops the first bomb, Little Boy, on Hiroshima. Within weeks to months, 70 to 80,000 civilians die. Hiroshima was a city in southern Japan, and it had some military significance. There were some military bases around it. The town of Hiroshima itself was largely civilian, however. So these were primarily civilians that were hurt by the dropping of this bomb. And there is reports the Americans did let the Japanese know. They didn't tell them specifically that they had an atomic bomb necessarily, but they did let them know that something bad was going to happen if they didn't surrender. So there's a lot of controversy about whether or not these bombs should have been dropped, and many people feel that it was not the right choice. Many people feel that it was the right choice because looking at the loss of life, it ended the war much quicker than had they allowed the fighting to drag on. It saved the lives of tens of thousands of American and Japanese soldiers, but it still remains a very controversial topic, and it's something you'll probably talk a lot about next year in U.S. history, because again, this is one of our iconic eras and one of our iconic actions in our history. We are the only nation to use an atomic weapon. We are no longer the only nation to have an atomic weapon, but we are the only nation to have ever dropped an atomic bomb on anyone else. So August 6th, we drop the bomb on Hiroshima. Lots of people die. We go to the Japanese, the Americans, and say, you need to surrender. The Japanese refuse to surrender. We tell them we're going to drop another bomb, essentially a rain of fire will rain down upon them, is from Truman. And that results in Fat Man being dropped on Nagasaki. Again, we have tens of thousands of civilians die, and then thousands more die in the following months from cancer and from radiation poisoning. It's really horrific and terrible. Truman was our president for only a few months. Franklin Delano Roosevelt actually died unexpectedly a few months prior to this, so that's another factor that leads to why the bombs were dropped, because Truman was relatively inexperienced at being commander-in-chief. And there we see a nice image of the bomb being dropped. Super crazy. To give you a sense of the destruction, these are photographs of Hiroshima. The photograph up on the top, where you can see lots of buildings and roads and whatnot, was Hiroshima before the bomb, and then we have Hiroshima after the bomb, and all that white is completely flat, because when the bomb dropped, it obliterated everything within a several-mile radius. Super intense, unimaginable. Here's another photograph, and you can see there's just a few buildings that remain. This used to be a landscape of buildings from as far as the eye could see, and you can just see the massive devastation. To give you a sense of the human costs, just kidding. Here's a photograph of Nagasaki, and again, all the buildings, and then looking at ground zero. Complete destruction within a matter of seconds. Here are some examples of the chemical burns that you saw, that people suffered from. Incredibly brutal, incredibly horrific. And then again, to keep in mind, this is not the end of it, that many people suffered from cancer, from poisoning for months, for years following. This is a horrible event in Japanese and American history. But after the second dropping of the bombs, the Japanese realized that there really is no hope for them. They cannot withstand more bombs being dropped upon them, which brings us to VJ Day, Victory in Japan. The Japanese formally surrendered on September 2nd. They actually really unofficially surrendered on August 15th, which is why if you go to England or Australia, they'll tell you VJ Day is August 15th. But for America, we consider it when they formally surrendered September 2nd, 1945. Which basically means the war lasted for 6 years and 1 day. And this is where we get the iconic photograph of the soldier kissing the nurse in a completely spontaneous moment. The famous photograph celebrating the end of this war, that many did not know when this war was going to end. And you think about the amount of sacrifice for people fighting, obviously, on the front lines, but for people on the home front, all the rationing and the fact that this war took over their entire life. This was truly a total war, and nobody could escape the war. So the exuberance and the joy of when this war was over was unprecedented and unmatched. But we know that, of course, even though the war is over, things do not go immediately back to normal, and we need to talk about that a little bit, because these countries where the wars were fought in the European Pacific Theater, they need to deal with how they're going to rebuild and move on from this war. So looking at Europe first, we see that cities are completely destroyed. If you think about what we learned from the Spanish Civil War and the use of air terror, think about Blitzkrieg and the Luftwaffe from the Germans, that air-delivered terror could be a successful means of fighting. And we see that in the destruction of cities. London is massively bombed, Dresden, Berlin, cities in Eastern Europe, Poland, Southeastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, Northern Italy, etc., are completely destroyed, completely bombed, which means people's livelihoods, their homes are completely destroyed. People have no electricity, water, little food to go on. Farms are also destroyed or being run through by tanks and all the masses of weapons. So it's really hard to pick back up because the land itself has been destroyed. Many people become uprooted. They become what's known as displaced persons, which is a term we still talk about today. If you think about the Syrian refugees or people fleeing Iraq or Afghanistan, or even people that have been fleeing Central America, they are all considered displaced persons in the sense that they have lost their place. Approximately 30 million people were displaced following the war. These are going to be your concentration camp survivors, prisoners of war who were set free, refugees, Germans who had moved into the annexed areas of Austria and Czechoslovakia and Poland, who were then basically kicked out of these countries once they regained their own sense of countryhood. Agriculture, as I mentioned, was totally destroyed. And even following this war, thousands died from famine. It's incredibly brutal. And this is a time in which you don't have the communication, we don't have the internet. It's harder for people to get a hold of their loved ones, to find their way back home, to find their community. So for months, even years at a time, people wander, trying to basically make their way back. Whoever read Survival in Auschwitz, Primo Levi speaks about his experiences following the end of the war and his struggle to find his way home. No spoilers, though. For the governments, they're also dealing with the fact that this war costs approximately $4 trillion, which is a massive amount. The amount of money that went towards the war effort that was not being spent on social services and programs for the people affected these countries for decades to come. Countries had to spend a lot of time rebuilding their infrastructure and their governments. And especially in Europe, if you think about the fact that, of course, Germany has been under the Nazi control since the 1930s, and then all the puppet governments, the governments that the Nazis instilled once they invaded or annexed, etc., these countries now have to rebuild their own government. They have to go back to either the type of government they had before they were invaded or annexed by the Nazis, or develop some new type of government. And many countries try something new, very similar to after we see with World War I. Many countries flirt with communism. Italy flirts with communism. France goes socialist for a while. Countries primarily in the West, they regain more democratic values, and then we see countries in the East turning more communist, which kind of makes sense because you think about they're closer to the Soviet Union, and also is going to lay the foundation for the Cold War that's going to emerge very quickly after this war, which is, of course, the epic showdown battle between the communist nations led by the Soviet Union and democratic nations led by America. We see this for showdown in Europe. These countries try to figure out what type of government they are going to pursue. In Japan, we see similar experiences. Cities have been totally destroyed by bombing raids. Tokyo is destroyed by bombs from the Allied powers. Hiroshima and Nagasaki obviously have to spend lots of their time rebuilding. Same thing with the people. We see lots of displacement, lots of struggle as the government tries to basically figure out itself again. But Japan is a slightly different experience because unlike Europe, Japan is actually going to be occupied by the Americans. Because what happens is we basically feel that we can't trust Japan to find their way again and find their way back to a democratic type of government. So America actually stays. And there's a nice picture of Douglas MacArthur, who is the head of our armed forces in the Pacific. He is also the head of the U.S. occupation in Japan, which is going to last for several years. So first we begin a process of demilitarization in which the Americans basically disband the Japanese military, get rid of all of the military, leaving only police forces. What does that sound like? Where's what we learned about countries that lost a global war and then having their military severely reduced? It's the same story, different time. In addition to this demilitarization, war criminals are also brought to trial, and I'll talk about that in later slides. The Japanese Pacific Empire, which as I mentioned was about 1 million square miles of land. At this point they had Korea, they had Manchuria, they had parts of China, they had Indochina, they had Indonesia, they had the Philippines, etc., etc. All of their lands are broken up, and these countries, just like we saw with Europe, have to kind of regain their government again and figure out what type of government they're going to have. And for some countries, we'll see this is going to lead to other conflict. Vietnam is going to have conflict as the French try to recolonize them, and then they start a civil war, which then we get involved with. We'll talk about that later. We see Korea being split up between the potential communists in the north and the Democrats in the south. We'll talk about that later as well. So under this period of democratization, so we demilitarized Japan, but we also democratized Japan, just force our democracy on them. So during this time period, America is going to helped Japan create a new constitution, which makes Japan into a constitutional monarchy. So they still have a monarch. The emperor is still around, although he has to declare he's not divine, so he's no longer a god, but just a man. And his power is decreased, so it's more like a figurehead. It's very similar to a country like England, in which they have the monarchy. Queen Elizabeth is still the head sovereign, but really it's Parliament that gets things done, in the same sense that Japan, their Congress, their Parliament still getting things done. And Shinzo Abe, who's the Prime Minister of Japan, is really the head of state, despite the fact that they still have this monarchy. We also see that power is given more to the people, so we see a greater emphasis on democracy, very similar to our nation, and we even see a constitutional Bill of Rights. So again, very similar to our Constitution, because basically the Americans at that time, Truman and then Eisenhower, felt, you know what, our Constitution, our type of government is great, let's force it on the Japanese. One interesting part of the Constitutional Bill of Rights, which is something we don't have in our Bill of Rights, is Article 9, saying that Japan can no longer make war, which is kind of an odd constitutional Bill of Rights to have, but it's still there. This image I thought was interesting. This is actually was created by the American War Department, basically trying to get rid of some of the organized religion in Japan and trying to separate that church and state a little bit, which I thought was just kind of an interesting aside. All right, so Japan, sorry, they demilitarize, they democratize, it's really exciting. We're still occupying them, but this finally ends in 1951. So on September 8th, 1951, Japan officially signs a formal peace treaty with the United States and 47 nations, although I believe the Soviet Union was not one of them. And this Treaty of San Francisco, signed right up north near Civic Center Plaza again, leads to U.S. occupation ending 6 months later, but we do still leave a military presence in Japan because Japan does not have a military of its own. And by 1951, a couple things have happened. We have China going to be a communist nation. Don't worry about this. We'll talk about it more in a few months or a few weeks even. And we also see the Korean War has broken out. So there's some conflict in the region, and that's one of the reasons why we leave our military presence, because we want to protect Japan, and we also definitely do not want Japan to turn and become a communist nation. So the overall results of this war, it's a massive war. It's affected every corner of the globe. Every continent has been affected, either through fighting or sending forces to fight or sending goods and arms, etc. So by the end of this war, we have 60 million people have died. This is an unprecedented number. We've never seen numbers like this. 2/3 of these 60 million, so about 40 million, are civilians. 25 to 27 million are Russians alone, which is just an insane number. The Russians lose over 25 million people, and yet they emerge as one of the strongest nations in the world, despite losing 25 million, which is crazy. To give you context, America, we lose 420,000 soldiers total, 420,000 people total, really, compared to millions dying. I think the Japanese lose about 2.5 million or more, so it's crazy. In addition to the dead, 50 million people are uprooted globally in both Europe as well as in Asia. Europe is destroyed. We see agriculture destroyed. Major cities have been bombed out, and they have to spend a lot of time on rebuilding. And the the United States even emerges as the strongest nation in the world, seconded by the Soviet Union. And really, it's a tie for a lot of things, but the fact that there's very little fighting on the United States soil once again, and the fact that we lose such fewer soldiers and we don't have to worry about rebuilding is really what helps us emerge. And these are things that we'll see once again as we start the Cold War. However, this war is slightly different in the fact that people who perpetuate crimes are brought to trial, because as we've been talking about, this is a war in which the brutality and the crimes against humanity are unprecedented. We've never seen such intentional attempts to destroy enemies, to destroy civilizations, to destroy peoples. We've never seen something like what we saw in the Spanish Civil War in Guernica. We never saw what we saw with the rape of Nanjing. We've never seen anything like what we saw with the Holocaust. So the extreme brutality of this war is something that is an important concept to understand. And because of this brutality, we see that there's an intentional attempt to respond to it. So we see trials, war trials, in both Europe as well as in Asia. So these are the Nuremberg and the Tokyo trials. Nuremberg is specifically chosen. It's a town in Germany, and as we'll talk about with the Holocaust, one of the first actions against Jewish citizens in Germany in 1935 was the enactment of the Nuremberg laws, which was the first set of legal distinctions saying that Jews could hold only certain types of jobs, that Jews could only live in certain types of areas, that Jews and non-Jews, specifically Aryans, could not marry, and if they were married already, their relationship was considered null and void, etc. And this is the first step to what we see as the later persecutions. It starts with discrimination, and then it starts with these types of laws, and then it starts with small violence and builds to the Holocaust. So Nuremberg is specifically chosen to reference that. Tokyo, specifically chosen because it's the capital of Japan. So they try both Nazis and war criminals in these trials that occur after the year. They both last for several years. And these trials are the big trials. This is where they try what's called Class A war criminals, so people who are responsible for either the Holocaust or for some of the more extreme, brutal aspects of the Japanese fighting. There are many more trials that go on for years and decades, frankly, following this war, in which thousands of people are tried and found guilty of various types of crimes. But for Nuremberg and Tokyo, it's primarily individuals who are accused of waging a war of aggression and committing crimes against humanity. And it's about 24 individuals each in Nuremberg as well as in Japan who are found guilty of these crimes, and many of them are actually put to death. The majority of the Nazis that were on trial were executed, as were many of the Japanese head military individuals. Something important to note is these Nuremberg and Tokyo trials. Following this, there's a sense around the world that never again will we allow this type of brutality to occur, this type of inhumane actions to occur. It creates the foundations for the Geneva Convention, which defines genocide, which is unfortunately a term that we will become very familiar with. Genocide is the targeting of a mass population based off race, gender, ethnicity, religion, etc., targeting and typically extermination of a group of people for one of these reasons. So the Holocaust is considered a genocide. What happened in Rwanda is considered a genocide. There are unfortunately many genocides that we will learn about. So Geneva Convention first establishes that concept of genocide as well as how individuals should be punished for such. It also is going to establish the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we will talk about in just a bit. Oh, there's the United Nations, speaking of such. So United Nations is founded by the Allied Powers in 1945 in San Francisco. That's why if you ever take part and you go to Civic Center, it's also United Nations Plaza, and you can actually go and see where it was founded, which is kind of cool. It begins with 51 member states. And this organization, which is still around to this day, has two goals: to establish peace and protect human rights. It's very similar to what we see of the League of Nations following World War I. It's slightly more effective, although that could be debated depending on what you were looking at or what you were hearing about. But really, it again grows out of these war tribunals and really the understanding and learning about the terrible events that occurred leading up to World War II and during World War II. There's a global sense that there needs to be an organization to prevent such actions from happening again. So the organization is established, it's set up, and there's several aspects to it. We have the General Assembly, and it's General Assembly of the member nations. As I said, it begins with 51. It's grown. There's about 190 odd member nations now in which they make decisions. For those of you who are in Model UN, this is all super basic information for you. There's also the International Court of Justice, who tries international criminals, Saddam Hussein, was tried there. Slobodan Milosevic would have been tried there. Various other war criminals. They just caught someone who was accused of basically a semi-genocidal act in, I think, Zimbabwe. He's on trial right now. We have the Security Council. This is our 5-member nation Security Council. America is one of them, as is Russia and China. They attempt to resolve conflicts somewhat successfully, somewhat unsuccessfully. And then they also support organizations like UNICEF, which is the United Nations International Children's Education Fund, UNESCO, which is for establishing World Heritage cultural sites, the World Health Organization, etc. So basically any organization that is devoted to some sort of world peace or some sort of protecting individuals really comes out of the United Nations. So following the end of World War following the end of World War II, we see Europe and Japan trying to rebuild, trying to reestablish themselves, and we see this sense of that we're part of a global community, and that this global community is dedicated to human rights. There really is a sense of never again. We want to learn from the mistakes of World War II, so we hopefully do not go down the same path again. And in some respects, I think we've been successful. Obviously, we look around the world, we see conflicts, look at what's happening in Syria, as well as in various other areas of the Middle East and in Central Africa, and there's more that can be done, but that's what we are learning from it. So that is where I'm going to leave you. So I hope you have enjoyed this lecture, and if you have questions, please email me. Otherwise, I will see you on Monday, and have a wonderful weekend. You've survived the lecture. Congratulations.